I'm glad to, because it means that we are also being able to reach out to the Italian audience, right? Since Foscari is structurally part of the seminar. I'm glad this session is probably helping to get the Italian audience more involved and acquainted with our seminar. But since many of you are new to this place, this is the International History Seminar, and it's an initiative that three public Mexican universities, CIDE, UNAM, and El Colegio de Mexico, jointly organized with Foscari University. We tend to discuss, as you can guess from the title of the seminar, international history issues understood in their broader meaning and sense. So those of you who would like to participate, we are actually welcoming proposals for presentation. Okay. So today, I was also waiting 2 minutes to give some time to Michael Schmidli, our today's discussant, to join. He told me he's almost ready. But while we wait for him to join, let me introduce our guest, Professor Duccio Basosi, who I thank for his availability to give this presentation today. Professor Duccio Basosi is a colleague and a friend from Foscari. It's not easy to define Professor Basosi work because it's really broad. In terms of interest, I would say that probably the best definition is an history of international relation with a strong expertise on the international history of the 1970s. He has a quite amazing book. If I'm not wrong, for the moment it's just been published in Italian because it's a great book on the Nixon shock, probably one of the best books in circulation. Those of you who read Italian, I strongly encourage you to take a look at that book. But more recently, he has been working on multiple topics, all interconnected, clearly related. The history of the international debt between the mid-1970s and the early 1980s, plus couple of great interventions on the history of the energy and the oil crisis, the shocks and the counter shocks. And today, to give another evidence of his ability to play in different fields, he's giving a presentation, as those of you who have read the text know this, on the reemergence of the use of totalitarianism as a tag, an adjective to define the Soviet Union. Reemergence happening at the time of the Carter administration. So I would say the paper it has a cultural history perspective, right? Sort of. And I can finally thank Michael Schmidli. Michael, I'm sorry for this little problem of time. We are dealing with 3 different times, so sometimes it's a bit hard to coordinate efficiently, especially when I am in charge of these aspects. So Michael is also a friend and a colleague from Leiden University. He has been working on the history of US foreign policy, especially focusing on the history of human rights, the interconnection, the intertwining between human rights and the US foreign policy in the 1970s and in the 1980s. His last book is Freedom on the Offensive, Human Rights, Democracy, Promotion, and USA Interventions in the Late Cold War, published by Cornell University Press. So, yeah, this is his last intervention. Michael is also writing a book, but this is a different story, a fiction book on, if I'm not wrong, on U.S. intervention in Vietnam and that region, which makes him even more interesting. And I would say that's all. Just to clarify the rule of the game, Duccio, Professor Basosi, is going to give a brief presentation. We agreed on 10 to 15 minutes, introducing the main points of his paper. And then Michael is going to comment on that. And then we open the floor for questions and the discussion. We should be basically done by 7 at the utmost, but let's see how this discussion goes. So if you agree, I would leave the floor to Professor Basosi, and so we can start this session of the International History Seminar. Thank you, Duccio. You have the word.
Thank you, Vanni, for your kind introduction. Can you hear me? Good. So first of all, good evening or good morning, depending on where you are. Hi also to Michael Zbigniew, long time no see. I think it was Artimino back in 2006, the last time we met. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to present my work at the International History Seminar. So thank you to everybody. The paper I'm presenting is a draft article on Jimmy Carter, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and the paradoxes of quote unquote Soviet totalitarianism in the late 1970s. More precisely, it is a DePaul made English translation from the Italian original. I would say a decent translation, though not a flawless one for those who have read it. Once completed and revised, the essay should enter an edited volume on the uses and abuses of totalitarianism as an intellectual category. So since this is the origin of the paper, I would say that the paper takes a somewhat phenomenological approach to its subject. It basically illustrates how, beginning in mid-1978, President Jimmy Carter started to address the Soviet Union as a totalitarian country. So not as a socialist country, not as a country with a different form of government than the United States, not as a bad country, not even as an authoritarian country, but a totalitarian country. So mine is a reflection on language, as Vanni said in his introduction. So the president first did this during a major foreign policy speech that he gave in Annapolis at the Naval Academy in June 1978. And then he resorted to this kind of language more and more often, and I would say with more radicalism throughout 1979 and 1980, as mutual tensions with Moscow grew exponentially. So this is in part a descriptive approach to what Carter did and the context in which he did it. But the paper also tries to make sense of what Carter meant, if anything, with that rhetorical choice of his. Of course, we should be aware of the fact that totalitarian and totalitarianism in US political and intellectual discourse were not just one adjective and one noun, however pejorative, to describe the Soviet Union. The two words, totalitarian and totalitarianism, had actually been the foundational words of the US's Cold War in the late 1940s and in the 1950s. The fight against Soviet totalitarianism had been the core, rhetorically and intellectually, of the US's Cold War. It was formally against totalitarianism that President Truman launched his doctrine in 1947, and it was the alleged totalitarian design of the Kremlin that left the authors of NSC 68 sleepless at night in 1950. But we should also be aware of the fact that since the early days of the Kennedy administration, such change of language, such kind of language had virtually disappeared from the White House. In case there's any need for further proof that after the mid-1950s, US-Soviet relations became something different than the original Cold War, I think this linguistic element contributes to prove the point. That stain of complete illegitimacy and even cruelty, which came associated with the notion of a totalitarian government from the very early 1960s, was no longer part of the US presidential rhetoric about the Soviet Union. And it was no longer so, I should add, not only because detente had made it tactically self-defeating to use it, but also because US academia had largely, even though not completely, concluded that the term was useless as an analytical category for the Soviet Union after Stalin. On this, I draw on the magisterial work by David Engerman on, Know Your Enemy, on US Sovietology, so-called. So in short, whatever its merits for the Stalin period, and these were also questioned to a certain extent in the 60s, the notion of totalitarianism, with its emphasis on a single, monolithic, violent, ideologically driven exertion of a constant power by the party over the population, all of this no longer seemed to apply to Khrushchev's and Brezhnev's Soviet Union, with its petty corruption, its relative liberalization, and at least for the Brezhnev period, its evident lack of ideological mobilization. Of course, in US culture, broadly speaking, neoconservatives and conservatives, including some intellectuals, kept that rhetoric alive through the 60s and 70s. But what is important here is that that was no longer the White House rhetoric. That is, until Jimmy Carter. So to understand what, if anything, underpinned Carter's rhetorical shift back to the language of Soviet totalitarianism, I think this is worth an investigation for at least three reasons. And I would say, first, it appears that that was one of the ingredients in the making of what historian Fred Halliday famously called the Second Cold War. Paradoxically enough, while in Jimmy Carter's intention, the 1978 speech in Annapolis was supposed to mend fences with Moscow after some recent tensions over the Horn of Africa, of course, the Soviets did not take it nicely to be addressed by a term which, according to their political dictionaries, should be reserved for, and I quote, bourgeois states with fascist regimes. Both in the meeting of the Politburo immediately after the speech and in a long unsigned document which appeared on Pravda, I think on 17 of June 1978, it's 10 days after the speech, the Soviet leadership clearly resented the US president's return to what it called a language reminiscent of the Cold War. Second, Carter's rhetoric is often contrasted with that of his successor in the White House, Ronald Reagan, in ways that typically see Carter coming out on top, at least on moral grounds. Of course, Carter was defeated by Reagan at the 1980 presidential election. But I'm thinking here of several recent biographies of President Carter and a few good works on Carter's communication style, Robert Strong's analysis of the Annapolis speech, Kevin Metzen analysis of the so-called Malaise speech of 1979. Here, Reagan is often represented as the ultimate seller of the myths and, if you want, lies about the US's providential destiny. Reagan is the salesman that knows little but can sell a product to a US public willing to believe the narrative. While Carter is often represented as a very well-informed, almost intellectual president, intellectually honest, and as a truth sayer, whose major shortcoming was eventually to be very knowledgeable about things and to tell things as they were, not trying to sell a product. So, in a sense, this is an opportunity to test such claim. Third, and I'd say connected to both points above, Jimmy Carter's right-hand man for foreign policy, Zbigniew Brzezinski, happened to have landed the position of National Security Advisor after an academic career where he had first tried to give intellectual coherence to the very notion of Soviet totalitarianism and totalitarianism in general, I have to say. Brzezinski in the mid-1950s was the co-author of one of the political science classics on the subject of totalitarianism. He was, together with his mentor, Carl Friedrich, he had been one of the two political scientists that had basically tried to put the indicators for judging whether a government was or not a totalitarian government, distinguishing it from different kinds of political regimes, including broader authoritarian regimes. But then, pretty much like most other Sovietologists, in the mid-1960s, Brzezinski had actually taken a distance from an intellectual category that no longer seemed to him either analytically or politically useful to understand the Soviet Union and to deal with it. So in the subgenre of international and intellectual history dedicated to the relations between US presidents and their respective advisors, what should we make of a situation where a president uses a concept that his main advisor has clearly repudiated on intellectual grounds? Now, methodologically, I've been reading dozens of public speeches by President Carter, and I scrutinized the drafts of some of his major speeches and the declassified documents around concerning the debates that surrounded those speeches within the administration. And eventually, I discovered that Carter's use of the term totalitarianism, and particularly that of Soviet totalitarianism, was quite shallow from an intellectual standpoint. If you will, I come to the conclusion that the US president pretty much abused the notion of totalitarianism and Soviet totalitarianism. At least if we are loyal to the definition of totalitarianism that Brzezinski had given. So a government that, if anything, needs to be incredibly repressive on the one hand, and on the other hand, needs to have a mobilizing ideology that permeates all levels of society to the point of annihilating society. That was, in a sense, the original definition. From this standpoint, Carter makes a very casual, shallow use of the term, in general, and also as referred to the Soviet Union. particularly during the first part of his presidency, he actually referred to disparate countries as totalitarian countries. Those ruled by white minorities in Southern Africa, Argentina, Ecuador, Venezuela, other South American governments, South Korea, the Dominican Republic. These were all called totalitarian by Carter in speeches throughout 1977 and 78. In many ways, his early use of the term was a way to say, I don't like this government, as applied to governments that most political scientists would likely have dubbed authoritarian, if anything. Importantly, the construction of the Carter corpus of speeches where totalitarianism appears clearly shows that totalitarianism is one of the two poles of an antinomy. It served the rhetorical purpose of recreating a sense of us versus them. In the United States, traumatized by the Vietnam War and the many scandals and revelations concerning US politics and US institutions. The Watergate scandal, of course, the assassinations of the Kennedys and Martin Luther King, and the scandals related to the CIA operations, et cetera, et cetera. A loss, if you want, of usual terms of references in the broader US public, well, marking us against them and marking them as totalitarian is a way to recreate a sense of us. And yet, precisely because it was used in such a casual, and instrumental way, it is interesting that totalitarianism was not used in direct reference to the Soviet Union before mid-1978. When it was used in reference to the Soviet Union in the Annapolis speech in June 1978, I suspect that the president was conscious of its denigratory sense, but he did not fully weigh the impact that his speech would have and the mechanisms that it would activate in the United States, where a language that belonged to the conservatives and the neoconservatives was now re-legitimized by a president who claimed to be searching for détente with Moscow. And of course, he did not weigh the impact that his speech would have in Moscow. As I said earlier, for Moscow, things were quite different. Being labeled totalitarians, maquette of Cold War. It contributed to raise suspicions, mutual misunderstandings, mutual rhetorical attacks, all conducive, as we said, to the Second Cold War, so-called. Now, interestingly, and I'm moving towards my conclusions, as I discussed in the paper, there seems to have been simply no discussion about the opportunity of using such a term in the making of the Annapolis speech, which is consistent with the fact that Carter used it somewhat casually, though some people, including Brzezinski, did notice that the term was strong rhetoric as applied to the Soviet Union. In his memoirs, Brzezinski claims to have been skeptical of the use of the term on that occasion. And in his NSC documents, I've seen and done a computer search throughout thousands of NSC documents. There's virtually no talk of the Soviet Union as a totalitarian country, or there's no talk, as far as I could see, of the Soviet Union as a totalitarian country in Brzezinski's NSC. Even more interestingly, there was apparently no discussion around using or not using the term in the preparations of any other speech after Annapolis. Even if you read the speeches by Jimmy Carter, by the end of his presidency, you will see that they are very hard to distinguish from Truman's speeches. It is US freedom Christianity versus Soviet Union totalitarianism, atheism reloaded. And yet, there seems to be nothing in the Carter administration's document equivalent to theoretical documents such as NSC 68 or to more tactical works like those conducive to the elaboration of the Truman Doctrine. Seen in this light, Brzezinski's attitude seems decidedly less coherent. And so you can think about the role of the intellectual advisor to the political president in this light. The White House made increasing use of the rhetoric of Soviet totalitarianism despite the national security advisor's enduring conviction of the concept's analytical uselessness and without any particular thought about its possible consequences in the United States and Moscow. Insofar as the administration never seems to have really worked out a reading of the Soviet Union as a totalitarian state, and indeed, being such reading rejected ex ante by the administration's principal theorists, it seems to be safe to say that for the Carter administration, the Soviet Union was totalitarian only insofar as it frustrated Washington's specific expectations about human rights, quote unquote, or the international balance of power. In this sense, Carter's depiction of the Soviet Union as totalitarian is very far even from that of the few historians that today still depict the entire Soviet experience from Lenin to Gorbachev in those terms. And I would say in this respect, it is no coincidence that among the US intellectuals of the 1970s, those few that were the remaining true believers in the totalitarian nature of the Soviet Union, I have in mind here historian Richard Pipes or political scientist Jean Kirkpatrick, well, they remained or became radical critics of the Carter administration's foreign policy, notwithstanding the radicalization of that foreign policy. And those intellectuals embraced Ronald Reagan's programmatic platform and rhetoric, just as Carter was adopting and re-legitimizing their own language. Thank you. I'm willing to listen to the comments and to respond to any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Basosi. Mike, when you want to start.
Okay, great. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me, and I really enjoyed reading this this essay, and I had forgotten that we had met in Artemino. That's really aging me now. I feel sort of embarrassed. Well, so I find this really quite interesting, and I want to just sort of run through the essay, and then I have some questions at the end. I mean, lots of historians look to Carter's Annapolis speech in early July of 1978 as a kind of milestone in the administration's attempt to clarify its position with vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And as Professor Basosi points out, this is an important moment where Carter is trying to correct the message in the media, right? To get away from this idea that the administration has mixed messages, and also to defend against the criticism that Republicans are making that that the administration is a sort of wishy-washy on the Cold War, that the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing, and so Carter makes this important speech, and really nothing changes. It just gets worse. Everyone, sort of that's watching this, that's, thinking about what the administration is trying to say, comes away from this thinking, okay, they are sending mixed messages, right? And so it completely backfires. But what interests Basosi in this is this one element, the term totalitarian, that Carter uses to describe the Soviet Union, and he calls it the T word. And I like that, the T word for totalitarianism. And he reminds us, or and I didn't really know this, how the term totalitarian to describe the Soviet Union had really changed over time. That in the early Cold War, it had been front and center in how US policymakers and academics are thinking about the Soviet Union. And if you watch the early Cold War cartoons, which I love to show my students on sort of, what is communism and how is it portrayed? It's this sort of big blue hand that just comes in and strangles politicians or crushes organized labor, or sort of all aspects of society get squished by this giant blue hand that represents totalitarianism, right? But then that shifts, right? Basosi argues that over the course of the 1960s, that's really been pushed aside in how academics are thinking about the Soviet Union, and that academic approach is going up, trickling up to how policymakers are thinking about the Soviet Union. And the sort of interesting connection to Brzezinski is that Brzezinski was an expert in this earlier period, that he's really defining the terms of totalitarianism. But then in the 1960s, he doesn't edit this sort of second edition of his book on totalitarianism, presumably because he doesn't think it applies anymore, right? And so if they ever come to me and ask for a second edition of one of my books, I'm going to have to remember this and think about whether my thoughts still apply to the situation. So this shift by Sovietologists on totalitarianism is significant at the academic level and also at the policy-making level. But then there's this other side of it that I think is really interesting, that I'd like to know a little bit more about, that totalitarianism is still very prevalent in American sort of public debate, right? The term is still used in a variety of contexts, but at sort of lower levels and in sort of a looser way. It's applied to segregation in the American South, right? Segregation is a form of totalitarianism. It's applied to corporate capitalism, right? I mean, what does that mean? What does it mean if totalitarianism can be both of these things? It's sort of lost any kind of it just becomes sort of pejorative in a loose, undefined way. It can be applied to Spain under Franco or to North Korea, right? I mean, what does it mean if it can be used in such different ways? So you've got the Sovietologists who are increasingly reticent to use the T word toward the Soviet Union, but then you've got Americans on both sides of the political spectrum using it in all these other weird ways. And so then that brings us to Carter, and Basosi argues that Carter picked up on this term, or used this term when his predecessors had not. So there's this sort of clear change over time between Jimmy Carter and his predecessors, going back to Kennedy, right? And then these moments like the Notre Dame speech, which is the sort of big moment for Carter to talk about human rights. I mean, that's what I always think of with the Notre Dame speech. But he also sort of juxtaposes nations where freedom of expression is taken for granted, and then totalitarian nations, right? So it's sort of like, who are the good guys who are the bad guys? How do we sort of, what's the box that we put the bad guys in? It's the totalitarian box. And so it's intentionally vague with Carter, or is it intentionally vague, or is it sort of just Carter, right? Carter seems to be always trying to play both sides to garner as much support as he can. And so is he being really smart about this and staying vague, or does he just not really know what he's talking about, right? That's sort of a question that is hard to pin down with him. And then Carter over time is using this term to describe all these different kinds of regimes. Argentina, South Korea, the Dominican Republic. So it has this sort of loose negative, these are all kind of bad regimes for various reasons. This is what we're going to call them. So if we get back to the Annapolis speech, Basosi argues that this is really a landmark moment in a process where the Carter administration becomes more radical in its anti-Soviet rhetoric, and I think that that's right. A more assertive criticism that the administration is making in trying to take a hard line against Moscow, trying to sort of prove its Cold War credentials against the Soviets. But of course, at the same time, Carter is still trying to work with the Soviets, right? He still wants to achieve success with the SALT II treaty. He still wants to work with them on human rights stuff, and so again, it's sort of like this is and this has come up in a number of historians have pointed to this, where Carter is being really critical, but then he still wants cooperation, and the Soviets are sort of taken aback and unlikely to sort of work with an administration that they feel is being overtly negative. And so Basosi argues that the Annapolis speech, it sort of starts this through line that runs all the way through the 1980 presidential campaign, where Carter is battling with Reagan, who's tougher on the Cold War. I mean, there's a number of other issues involved, but this is a really important one as this sort of resurgence of Cold War tension really takes off. So I think that this is really interesting. I mean, given the importance of the Annapolis speech, right? Given the fact that this is supposed to be the big speech, and Carter's really putting it all on the line here, you would think that Carter and his team would have spent a lot of time going through the speech, figuring out, what do we really mean by totalitarianism? And what Basosi finds is that there's very little discussion, right? That they're not really having this kind of an intellectual debate. And so, who put it in there? Who was the one who inserts that? And what Basosi comes up with is that it's probably Carter, right? Probably Carter is the one he's been using this and puts it in there. It probably doesn't come from Brzezinski, because Brzezinski's doesn't think that term applies. And in the National Security Council documents that Basosi looked at, that term is not there in relation to the Soviet Union. So it's doubtful that it's Cyrus Vance and the State Department who puts it in. So it's probably Carter, right? And so that raises this difficult question of why did Carter do it? Did he do it for some really smart reason, because he had his own sort of perspective on the Cold War as a kind of intellectual, or did he do it because he didn't really know that much about the Cold War, about U.S. foreign policy, about this kind of terminology and what impact using terms like that would have? So Basosi's conclusion is basically that Carter used this term as a term of disdain, that it wasn't that it was sort of decoupled from the traditional meaning that it had. It was kind of decoupled from the way that the U.S. policymakers had thought about it in the early Cold War. and he connects it to the debate under Truman. And Basosi argues that it was really the sort of Washington being frustrated at the Soviet Union on issues like human rights and sort of trying to construct or promote a U.S.-led world order, a balance of power where the U.S. was the sort of primary actor. The frustration of the Soviets in regard to that is what leads Carter to use this term. So, questions that I have. First of all, I want to know more about Jimmy Carter. I mean, I hesitate to say that because I've already written a book about Carter, and there was a time in my life where I didn't want to think about Carter ever again. But here I am saying I want to know more. I do want to know more. When did Carter start using this term? I mean, did it predate the 1976 presidential campaign? Does he talk about it in his memoirs? The question of why Carter latches onto this when it had fallen out of favor with the other presidents and the Sovietologists isn't really answered here, and it's sort of tantalizing. And I wonder if he was doing it because he thought it would resonate with ordinary Americans, that he thought, just the sort of Main Street Americans understood that term in a way that policy elites and academics, did not. A second and sort of related element is this relationship between Carter and Brzezinski. I mean, my understanding is that Brzezinski was the defining figure in Carter's education on foreign affairs. That Brzezinski was tutoring him, right? That Carter was learning about the world from Brzezinski. The Trilateral Commission stuff and these memos that Brzezinski would send on foreign policy stuff. And if that's the case, if Brzezinski is such an important figure for Carter in teaching him about foreign affairs stuff, then why would he let this go? Why would he sort of not step in and say, hey, you're a smart guy, you should know that this term doesn't apply. The third question that I have is about the Carter administration and its formulation of foreign policy. I mean, scholars have criticized Carter for lacking a clear structure, lacking a way to integrate foreign policy issues, disparate issues, integrating them into a kind of some sort of cohesive manner that could be addressed in a more comprehensive way. And instead, these issues get sort of compartmentalized. That makes it hard to deal with them in a cohesive manner. I mean, is Carter's use of the word totalitarian a similar kind of problem? Does it reflect the broader problems that scholars have pointed to in the workings of the administration? And then the last point that I have, I mean, I'm interested in this, in the role of, or the relationship between human rights and figures like Jeane Kirkpatrick, who of course were really critical of the Carter administration. And I want to know a little bit more. I mean, at a certain level, it seems like Jeane Kirkpatrick, who was also kind of channeling that early Cold War liberalism, right? I mean, she's sort of channeling Truman in a way. It seems like as the Carter administration becomes more radical in the sense that they're using this tougher language, that she would be more willing to get on board. And they're sending Brzezinski over there and Mondale and these more like sort of hawkish Democrats. And yet, instead, you have all of these Cold War liberals who become the neoconservatives and then play a big part in the Reagan administration. So what does the totalitarian debate really tell us about the split in the Democratic Party with the neoconservatives that is a really defining moment in this time. So again, I want to really say thanks for giving me the chance to read it. I really enjoyed it, and yeah, I look forward to the questions and comments.
Thank you, Mike, for these comments, which I think are already creating a proper field for the discussion. We usually usually take a round of questions after comments. So Duccio, Professor Basosi, I would ask you to address comments and the first round of questions at once, okay? If there are questions, of course, but I'm sure there will be few hands out there raised. Okay, the floor is open for questions. Okay, but you can use also the Zoom hand, so I can basically thank you. Okay, good. In this way it works better. Okay, Ilaria Sicari, and then Gerardo, and then Chiara Bonfiglioli. Go ahead, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for this seminar that you organized. Thank you, Duccio, for your very, very interesting talk. I just introduce myself. I'm Ilaria Sicari. I'm a Marie Curie Fellow of Foscari University. At the moment, I'm at Stanford, and I'm in Italy. I'm supervised by Duccio Basosi. And I'm working on the cultural Cold War. So I really appreciate the point about the reaction and about the role of Brzezinski in refusing in such a way this word, not totalitarianism. But I have more than a question, how to say, an observation, because it seems to me that the role of Brzezinski has in this history, it should be also evaluated from his habits. So his role as a actor, individual in this history. Because, for example, the point that he was Eastern European immigrant, I think that play a role in the fact that he don't suggest the use of this word, and also maybe it seems to me that he, which was born in the USSR, in Poland, and after leave the country, had a kind of role in these, his, how to say, sensibility. So, because as you note, and you told us, in the Soviet Union, the use of these words and this shift, this rhetorical shift, was for sure was received in a very negative way, even because if we consider then also from a cultural point of view, in historical and rhetorical, political rhetoric point of view, in the USSR, this term, the totalitarianism, was for sure referred to fascist totalitarianism. So you also mentioned this point, so that for the USSR, it was not acceptable to be defined in that way, not only because of the the reference to the political government, the kind of government, but because of its ideological relation in the political rhetoric and also historical rhetoric in the USSR, of the connection with the fascism. And I think that some traces of this rhetoric could be also found nowadays. So, well, so I would like to probably to suggest also this perspective, like the role of Soviet and Eastern European white émigrés in the global narration and interpretation of the diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, but also diplomacy in general during the Cold War, because they played a very essential role, like mediator, first of all, and also because in the majority of cases they were very fervent anti-communist. So,
okay,
thank you very much.
Thank you, Ilaria, for this question. Gerardo, and then Chiara.
Hello, Duccio, Michael. It's very nice to see you both. Michael, I think you've read some of my stuff as a draft. So I thank you every day for those comments. They were really good. Thanks a lot for everyone at the seminar and everyone present here. So your essay is very, very interesting and very suggestive. And it did raise a lot of questions for me. So one of the things one of the problems I think Carter has is that he's telling, but he's not showing, meaning that his rhetoric is sometimes it doesn't go in a parallel way with his actions, with his policies. And I find this quite interesting because he also often has a tougher rhetoric than his actual policies. So I'm talking here specifically about, while he's using terms like totalitarianism, etc., he's also having a policy that's way more tolerant to different political sort of configurations, right? This is the great moment in which, for example, in 1979, Carter gives the revolutionaries in Nicaragua this big pass. It's like, okay, maybe there's something in between totalitarian communism and like outright democracy, and maybe these people are in that middle space. So for him, he seems to have a grasp of those sort of more nuanced visions of political configurations. And it's very interesting that even though he does have this conscious of them, he's using very broad political terms, right? So I believe this is related to, I mean, you mentioned it, to specifically who Carter is trying to talk to. And I do believe this is tied specifically to internal domestic US policy, right? He's trying to talk to a very specific American conservative that he has already identified that he has a problem in terms of the electoral system, right? So I think he's probably trying to mobilize the American people, right? He's probably very inspired by his own religious views about the world, right? Totalitarianism and atheism seems to be kind of interchangeable in some aspects, right? But finally, this leads me to another question, to my actual question, which is, even though he's using the term totalitarianism, it's affecting his relationship with the USSR, which I think he already knew, right? Is he also affecting other relationships with the use of these terms? So for example, you mentioned that he's using it to describe Venezuela, which is a bit hilarious to me because Venezuela is the only democracy in that region in that time, right? And not only that, is like his only partner. They actually have a very good relationship between Perez and Carter and stuff. So it seems truly puzzling that he would be using this for the Dominican Republic, for Venezuela, right? Not Panama, interestingly enough, though. Like this is the moment where they're negotiating with a dictatorship, the Panama Canal treaties. So yeah, my general question is this: like, he's using it to describe the Soviet Union, but is he also affecting other international relations by using this unwittingly? Thank you very much, Duccio.
Thank you, Gerardo. Chiara?
Hi, everyone. My name is Chiara. I am a colleague of Professor Basosi at Ca' Foscari. My question is about the influence of such a speech into dissident circles, we could say, in Eastern Europe. Like, was there already a sense of using totalitarianism as a category there, or is that something that, because I'm not really an expert of US history, but I work on the Balkans, and this whole category of totalitarianism is somehow still applied to issues such as, women's agency under socialism and things like that. So that kind of legacy of totalitarianism, which reflects also in policies such as the one by the European Union on the victims of Stalinism and Nazism, and this comparison that has been very much pushed by member states from Eastern Europe. Was that something that started then, that usage of totalitarianism, or did this speech by Carter somehow amplify this idea? Thank you so much.
Okay, one last question, and then we'll let Professor Basosi answer. Andrea Torrealba, please.
Thank you, Vani, and thank you, everyone. I'm Andrea. I'm also a member of the seminar. And I would like to ask this question to Professor Duccio, that is actually something that appeared in my own research. So I'm sorry if this is a little bit like particular. So I'm working about like how democracy has been constructed in Chile in the 1950s. And it's very interesting because in 1948, some anti-communist policies were there, and the discussion between the anti-communist parties and the communist democratic parties are around how they tell each other that the other is a totalitarian. And I know this is very early in the Cold War, but for me, it's like totalitarian in that moment, it's equal to anti-democratic. But not only anti-democratic, because the anti-communist parties think that totalitarian is equal to fascism, and the communist parties think totalitarian is, the other way around. Anti-communist parties think totalitarian is communist, and the communist democratic parties think that totalitarian is fascism. So this is very interesting because I can recall in your own work that there's a continuity, and I feel how this rhetoric remained in the shadows, but wasn't erased until and appear again in 1978, 1980s. So I have received some critiques about this. Some professors have told me that this is plain or a vacuum rhetoric, but from my point of view, it isn't, because it's very different to think that the other is fascist or communist, although both are told like totalitarian. I don't know if I have make me understood, but yeah, that's it's not a question actually, but like to think how these remain in the shadows and then appear again. So that for me is very interesting with your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. And Duccio, please.
Yes, Thank you very much to all of you. I was trying to write down a few notes in order to try and answer all these stimulating questions. I will try to go by order, and in some cases, I will frankly say that I don't know the answer. All right. Michael, you're perfectly right. When did Carter start to use that term? Unfortunately, I could not go much deeper than the electoral campaign. All right. There's no reflection on it in the memoirs by Carter. There's no reflection in his diary about the term. To the best of my knowledge, there's never a moment where Carter actually spends much time talking about, oh yeah, totalitarianism, this is what I mean. All right. He did use the term in the electoral campaign, not in reference, or at least not in direct reference to the Soviet Union, pretty much in that attempt to say, well, we democratic, they totalitarian, all right? But it's very vague. That is still a phase where everything is very vague. And to a certain extent, the same thing applies also to the question, why did he use it? All right. Since it's not thematized, since there's no gathering, people around the table saying, well, should we use this or should we not use this? All right. To make things clear, when Truman gave his Truman Doctrine speech, all right, March 1947, Truman uses totalitarian and totalitarianism something like 30 times throughout the speech, okay? It's the crucial concept in the speech, all right? And in the previous weeks, the people that had been behind the creation of the speech basically said, well, totalitarianism is the way that we link the new adversary or new cold enemy with the enemies that we have just defeated, the fascists, to which totalitarianism had been reserved up until that point. All right, so here's a tactical deployment of the term. All right, it's what philosopher Laclau would call the chain of equivalences. All right, it is what a mechanism that enables the public to get acquainted with the notion that, okay, this thing is similar to that very bad thing which we were used to. All right, and there's clearly the decision, the conscious decision to say, yes, this is going to be the crucial term that we use. All right, and then as early theorizing about the nature of totalitarianism comes about, the language of not the public speech, but a document like NSC 68 attaches to being totalitarian a set of specific descriptive features and prescriptive implications. That is also crucial, all right? And again, I'm saying nothing original here. I think David Engerman says it in the most brilliant way. I mean, if you are totalitarian, you're not simply bad. You're also an expansionist, which is crucial for the coherency of the US strategy in the late 40s, early 1950s, all right? So all of that is thematized, it's theorized, all right? There's nothing like that for the Carter administration. So in a sense, what you can do is guess, all right? And my guess, all right, I think it's like an informed guess, and yet In a sense, I have to recognize that I'm still guessing. I'd say that Carter did use it because he knew it would resonate with the public, yes, but not in a very self-conscious way. I don't think there was Carter saying, oh yeah, I'm going to use this term because, or at least originally, it was not that way. At one point, it might be that somebody told him, hey, this term is very loaded, all right? And yet, no records I found for that. And yet, so if I look at the available record, I would say Carter was, first of all, a recipient of what Walter Hickson would call the hegemonic culture. He must have heard it probably in his youth, of course, in the 50s, and he must have heard that Soviet Union totalitarian, he must have watched one of those cartoons, etc. And this may have come out in the late 1970s, even without such, an explicit reflection or a full weighting of the potential consequences and implication of doing that. Of course, he was a recipient, but since he was the president, he amplified it, of course. All right. And then, in a sense, he played along as the consequences, domestic and international, began to materialize. Again, concerning Brzezinski, the only evidence I have, I mean, it's interesting that in his memoirs, Brzezinski speaks about, writes about the Annapolis speech, and he says, well, I don't take responsibility for the tough part of the Soviet Union, all right? The speech was a very incoherent speech, all right? It brought together a part where Carter said, oh yeah, we believe in detente, we've done a lot with the SALT Treaty, and we're looking forward to a SALT II treaty. I pay tribute to the blood that the Soviet citizens have spilled during World War II against Nazism. And of course, you guys are totalitarians, all right? And we don't like you. And so, to answer your question, Michael, I think, yes, eventually, my take is that this reflects the broader incapacity by Carter to provide a clear, single message. And in a sense, yes, a lack of coherency. Gerardo, I think this is also an answer to your question. Carter was, in fact, more tolerant in several ways compared to Nixon, compared to even Truman or Eisenhower, of course. But he was more tolerant in a way that had inconsistencies with other elements of what he was doing. Still, Michael's point. Again, the only evidence I have about Brzezinski is Brzezinski realized that was loaded language, all right? And in fact, when he published his memoirs, he did notice that. I would not have called the Soviet Union a totalitarian state, all right? Why didn't he say anything? He claims, and we cannot verify, I think, there's no way to verify this, that he expected, since he was known as the hawk in the administration, he claims that he expected the dogs in the administration to object. And since they didn't, the word simple ended up in the speech. I have no way to verify that. I think that there is some intellectual honesty there. And the fact that Brzezinski never taught, as far as I know, of totalitarianism in his many NSC documents gives some credibility to that. In a sense, he stuck to his intellectual position, even though, of course, as the counselor to the princeps, to the president, probably his role should have been to make the implications as clear as possible. Also because, and I think this is important, and again, I try to bring together both Michael's question about Jean Kirkpatrick and Gerardo's question about who was he talking to, all right? I think particularly in reference to the Annapolis speech, but not only to that, of course, any speech given by an American president about foreign policy is always directed both to the public abroad and to the public at home, all right? And in the case of the Annapolis speech, this is made clear by Carter himself. The night of the speech, he wrote in his diary, I hope that the speech is perceived as tough at home and soft in Moscow. I don't know how he thought it would be perceived as soft in Moscow, really. At home, it was perceived in contradictory ways, but eventually it was perceived as contradictory itself. Original reactions were kind of, you know, somebody says, oh, it's a good speech, tough. Somebody says it's a good speech, soft. A lot of people said this is contradictory, and eventually it remained in the memory as a contradictory speech. The role of Brzezinski. Kirkpatrick. I think Kirkpatrick. I have not done research on Kirkpatrick, of course, but the way I read her essay, Dictatorships and Double Standards, where she makes the case, and this is 1979, and then becomes a book later, and it's very important in the cultural debate in the United States leading to the Reagan election. I think the way Kirkpatrick takes the use of totalitarian language by Jimmy Carter as applied to the Soviet Union is, since you admit, unlike your predecessors, since you claim that the Soviet Union is totalitarian and not simply authoritarian, then your policies should be completely different than what they are. So why didn't she jump on the boat? No, I think that she made use of the Carter's rhetoric, saying, okay, so we agree on the fact that the Soviet Union is a totalitarian country. Then the policies should be much more tough than they are under Carter. This is what I get from it. Brzezinski, of course, Brzezinski as an immigrant, there would be a lot to say about that. Yet Brzezinski had not spent really much time in Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe. All right, he was, yes, technically born in Poland, but he was the son of a diplomat and basically grew up in Canada and in the United States. So, of course, he had linguistic knowledge. So that's one of the reasons why, of course, he could speak as an authority on Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. But in this sense, he has a very different relationship to his original home country than Kissinger had. Right? the two are often brought together because they seem to have similar experiences, but they're not exactly the same thing. Gerardo, did Carter's broader talk of totalitarianism affect other relations? It would be interesting to do some research on that. I mean, how did the Venezuelans take their designation as totalitarian? I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. But indeed, it would be interesting in terms of drawing a comparison. For the Soviets, this was really linguistic dynamite. All right? To the point that I've done some research in Soviet political dictionaries. The 1980 edition of the dictionary, I told you that the Soviet encyclopedia, political encyclopedia, called totalitarian a bourgeois state with a fascist government. All right. The 1980 edition, so right after that, actually expands on the concept and says, well, totalitarian is also a derogatory way in which Cold Warriors talk about us. All right. So the message really got heavy in Moscow. Chiara, again, I don't know about the influence of the Carter talk of totalitarianism outside the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. Václav Havel, in those same years, particularly after Carta 77 and in his works that were translated and published outside of Czechoslovakia, Havel uses the term post-totalitarian to refer to the Czechoslovak society of the late 1970s. It's the post-totalitarian. And what happens is that, but here we're moving away from Jimmy Carter, and we're moving closer to how, to the general debate on how, and I think I also respond in a sense to Andrea's comment. Remember, originally this piece comes from a request by the editors of the volume that is in preparation, that is basically an attempt to write a phenomenology of a controversial category, all right? And indeed, among the things that make the category controversial is that historians still today have a debate about whether the Soviet Union was or not a totalitarian experience. One, whether it was a totalitarian experience under Stalin, but not after Stalin. Two, what it means to be totalitarian. Because in the recent reiterations of the debate, those few historians, I think I would say it's a quite clear minority of the historians that claim that the Soviet experience was a totalitarian experience from Lenin to Gorbachev included. All right, Martin Malia is the main exponent today. Of course, Richard Pipes, but again, there's not so many historians that would make that claim today. But part of their argument is that it's not the actual situation that matters, it's the intention. Okay, it's not that the system was really totalitarian, but it did have totalitarian ambitions. All right. Of course, however, this implies that you are taking the original definition and watering it down. All right. The bigger, the looser you make the borders of the concept, the more things you can stuff into it. All right. And of course, eventually you can put completely different things. It's always been like that to a certain extent. Michael Smedley reminded us that Martin Luther King considered the South of the United States totalitarian because of segregation. All right. But of course, does it really make sense for us as analysts, as historians, to use an adjective where you can put the segregated South, Nazism, Brezhnev's, or even Gorbachev's Soviet Union? I don't think so. I don't think so. The other point that these historians are trying to make is that in the late 1980s, as the dissidents had greater access to the media, and even Gorbachev at one point, when they talked about the recent Soviet experience, they did use the term totalitarian. All right. Gorbachev, in his final speech in December 1991, actually says, we succeeded in bringing an end to the totalitarian system. So among the paradoxes of this story is the one that basically some of the protagonists from the other side of the Iron Curtain eventually adopted that same language. I'm not sure that this is a very healthy way to put the discussion, to look at how those more or less victimized by a phenomenon describe the phenomenon. I wouldn't say provides a green pass to the phenomenon itself. Just think in terms of green passes, what we've heard in recent years about the COVID green passes as symptoms of totalitarianism, et cetera, et cetera. So I would be careful with that. And I hope I've answered to all the questions.
I think you did. Let's see if there are a couple of more questions before we steer towards the end of the seminar. Anybody else?
Don't be shy.
I have a question. Whilst we wait for the audience to take the courage to intervene once more. Well, I'm not really an expert of the this aspect, this cultural aspect of how the totalitarian concept became part of the political language. Of course, I'm familiar with its use, but not with the chain process, right, which made such a concept a central one in the foreign affairs language of the political elite of the United States. Nevertheless, when I was reading the part of your paper where you try to retrace the trajectory of the use of this term, I was surprised because when I read the title of the paper, and a few weeks ago read the first 10 lines, I was sure that I was going to find, for example, an author like, not for example, I was sure I was going to find Hannah Arendt as probably one of the main driver of the conversion of a sort of a philosophical concept into a concept belonging to the sphere of political language, foreign affairs language. Now, it is true that there is an interesting mismatch there, because if I'm not wrong, The Origins of Totalitarianism is published in 1951 in English. So it's a bit later when the first use, one of the first massive use, right? You counted 30, 40 times in the Truman Doctrine speech. Nevertheless, my question is, did you find anything leading there? For example, when you were talking about the political education of Brzezinski, I would also have expected to find some link, right, to the discussion and the definition that Hannah Arendt is using in that book. Yeah, that would be my question. And anybody else? Before we give Professor Basosi the chance to answer to my very important question. Okay, Duccio. Anna Sofia, she's waving hand. Okay, let's take one more and then, yeah. Okay, Anna Sofia Rodriguez.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Professor Basosi, for being here. Also to Professor Schmidtli. It's not a super well formulated question, but because I have to admit that I actually read your paper on Cuba, thinking that was actually what we were going to discuss. But hearing you, I don't know, it made me think of your paper on Cuba in terms of. I was very surprised that there was no mention of, how totalitarianism is related also to imperialism. I was sort of thinking of what Andrea was saying. They were very much two intertwined concepts for a very long time. And it doesn't appear at all, apparently, here. So I wanted to ask you if the concept is related to this other concept being used by Carter in the international arena of sort of anti-imperialism, neocolonialism. He calls the Cubans as puppets of Moscow. I'm assuming it doesn't, like the link does not appear in what you've seen. Therefore, do you think it would be a productive thing to explore? Maybe, this concept in relation to the other concept being used by Carter, besides human rights, because of course human rights is the obvious one, but he's also pushing forward these other very new concepts, thinking, as used by an American president.
Okay, thank you, Vladimir. Thank you, Anna Sofia. And I guess that, Hannah Arendt, I think, is in a sense present in both questions, at least implicitly. Hannah Arendt's, and you could add another author, which we did not mention, but that was very important in giving shape to the notion of totalitarianism in the 1940s, which is, of course, Friedrich von Hayek. All right. According to Friedrich von Hayek, basically, any policy like the New Deal or the Labour Party program in the UK would ultimately lead to the totalitarianism that he saw in the Soviet Union. All right. So you could wonder whether the recovery of neoliberal themes under Carter had anything to do with that. But again, since it's never thematized, you can only guess. Hannah Arendt's text actually is a very complex text, and while it is considered a classic, I have to say that it is also the subject of heavy criticism in many ways. All right. It is very uneven. All right. It actually deals with totalitarianism only at the very end of a text that, for the most part, in reality speaks of imperialism. All right. So yes, there's a connection there, but in reality, it's not really that Hannah Arendt makes the connection clear. Also because, as one reviewer stated, I think it's 50 years ago, Hannah Arendt does not really define totalitarianism. She connotes totalitarianism. Basically, she makes the case, she posits that Italian fascism, to a certain extent, no, well, not really, German Nazism and Soviet totalitarianism, Soviet communism, those are totalitarian phenomena. Okay, she posits that and then elaborates on the origins, intellectual, cultural origins, political origins of that. But she doesn't really say what makes those phenomena totalitarian. All right, so in a sense, this is the reason for which the Brzezinski-Friedrich approach, even though it was criticized, all right, but in a sense, it became the term of reference in political science because at least it had the advantage of saying, what is the broad category of totalitarianism? And if we start from the indicators that would make a phenomenon, a political phenomenon, totalitarian, who should we put into it? All right. And what actually happens in the 1960s, when, as Professor Midley reminded us, Brzezinski says, I'm not going to participate in the second edition of my text, is that as the Soviet Union quite clearly no longer belonged to those, no longer corresponded to those indicators, what Friedrich was trying to do was to water down the definition. All right. And in a sense, with some intellectual consistency, Brzezinski says, no thanks. All right. Where I think, however, Hannah Arendt and the original notion, the original Brzezinski-Friedrich notion of totalitarianism may have played a, I would say, largely unconscious role in giving shape to Carter's Annapolis speech is precisely in the notion of totalitarianism as a phenomenon for export. Again, I'm not sure that, and probably not, Carter, I don't see Carter really thinking too much about this, but what Carter thinks at the time is that what is going on in Angola, what is going on in the Horn of Africa, that yes, involves Cuba, but this is actually the Soviet Union puppeteering Cuba behind the scenes. One, all right? Starting from this premise, which is also very shaky, but in a sense, Carter gets the confirmation that what we're having here is not simply a localized phenomenon, an authoritarian government, but an imperialist, an intrinsically expansionist authoritarian project, all right? And this was very present also in the 1950s. So I think there's a genealogy here, all right? Totalitarianism, since it is so bad domestically, and since it can never achieve domestic legitimacy, then it must always find an enemy. And this is how we explain what is going on in Angola or in the Horn of Africa. All right, of course, it's within a kind of closed circuit, in my view, but we should open a lot of different topics here, and we're not going to do that. But I think there's an implicit genealogy from Hannah Arendt and notions of imperialism in the notion that the Soviet Union, the original speech by Carter, Soviet Union is trying to export a totalitarian form of government. All right. Again, not a very self-conscious or a reflected approach to the issue, and yet, in many ways, reflecting what I think was the hegemonic culture under which Carter had grown up and amplifying the message. I hope I've answered.
Yeah, I think you definitely Did. So I think we squeezed enough, Professor Basosi, and so if there are no more questions, I think we can basically get to the end of this seminar. Professor Basosi, Duccio, thank you very much. I think it was a great session. Mike, Professor Schmidli, thank you for your comments, and thank everybody for joining us and for triggering such a lively discussion this evening. We'll see you within a month for our next seminar. I don't remember who is presenting, but we will be soon circulating and advertising the next session. Have a great evening.
Thank you again.
Thank you.